Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for being here with us this afternoon to participate in this program as part of the Law and Democracy Speaker Series. My name is Arya Goyal. I am a class of 2029 studying math and theater. I'm a student assistant at the Rockefeller Center, and it is my pleasure to welcome you today to today's program. Law and Democracy is a series of conversations focusing on foundational laws, policies, and institutions as we approach the semi-quincentennial milestone of the Declaration of Independence. This series builds on the Rockefeller Center's commitment to bringing our community together in discussion with a wide range of experts and practitioners to examine and deliberate on these themes. We are grateful to Dartmouth Dialogues, the Office of the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, and the Office of the Associate Dean for the Social Sciences for being crucial partners in making this series happen. We would like to welcome our virtual attendees who are joining us today via live stream. For those joining us in person, when we reach the audience Q&A portion of our program, we will have a staff member in each aisle with a microphone. We ask that attendees with questions line up by these staff, but please keep lines to a minimum and do not obstruct the views of other members of the audience. As a reminder, Dartmouth is committed to protecting free expression and peaceful dissent. We encourage you to ask questions during the Q&A, but ask that you do not interfere or disrupt today's program, which would include preventing attendees from seeing or hearing our guest and moderator, or interfering with our guest and moderator's ability to speak or be heard. This conversation will be moderated by Professor Kristen Smith, Rockefeller Center Policy Research Shop Director and Visiting Associate Professor of Sociology, and Quinn Allred, class of 2026. Quinn is a member of the New Hampshire Democratic Party Executive Committee and the founding Executive Director of Let Us Lead. Congressman Chris Pappas is currently serving his fourth term representing New Hampshire's 1st District. A lifelong resident of Manchester, New Hampshire, Chris began a career in public service while helping run his family's over 100-year-old restaurant. In Congress, Chris focuses on the issues that matter most to Granite Staters, including improving access to health care, lowering costs, combating the addiction epidemic, and protecting our environment and drinking water. He serves as ranking member of the Subcommittee on Economic Opportunity for the House Veterans Affairs Committee, where he is working to ensure veterans have access to education, employment, housing, and more. Chris also serves on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, where he is fighting to modernize our nation's infrastructure, create jobs, and improve quality of life in New Hampshire. Please join me in welcoming Congressman Chris Pappas to the stage.
Thank you so much for joining us here today at Dartmouth. We are so happy to have you on this frosty afternoon here in Hanover. You have a really impressive career, and I just want to go through a few of the posts that you've held. So starting with the New Hampshire House Representatives in 2002, then Hillsborough County Treasurer, the New Hampshire Executive Council, and the House of Representatives currently, and now a run for the U.S. Senate. So I'd love to hear a little bit about your path to politics. You know, what drew you into politics? What were some of those defining moments? And maybe a few pieces of legislation that you've been particularly proud of.
Well, thanks, Professor, for the opportunity. And Quinn, thank you. Thanks to all the students and members of the Dartmouth community that are joining this conversation here today. It's a real honor to be up here. You know, I don't represent Hanover and Dartmouth in my congressional district, so it's great to cross that dividing line between the two seats in New Hampshire and to be here in the Upper Valley. My first introduction to Dartmouth was as a kid, coming with my grandfather to football games. He was a Dartmouth alum, class of, I think, 1941. And so I'm sure if he was still around when I went to college, I would have disappointed him by not coming to Dartmouth. I went to a school in the Boston area instead. But I have great memories of coming here as a kid. And so I thank you for the forum that you create here and the dialogue that Dartmouth is prioritizing, which I think is so essential at this moment in our history, both for young people that are beginning to find the tools they have and to find their voice, as well as for the entire community. We all need to be figuring out how we can talk to one another and move forward with a sense of common purpose as a nation. That couldn't be more important as we reach this historic milestone, the 250th anniversary of America's independence. So, you know, I found my path into politics when I was in high school. I was a student at Manchester Central High School. I grew up in the city of Manchester. It was a city that was not valuing and prioritizing investments in public education at the time. And so a group of friends and I got engaged with our local board of aldermen and school board, began to advocate around educational funding. And sort of one thing led to another, and I started working on campaigns and volunteering with that same group of friends. When I graduated from college, I was just a few weeks out of college and got recruited to run for a seat in the New Hampshire House. I mean, when you stick around here long enough in New Hampshire, you're all going to become state representatives at one point in time. Like, it's just your destiny. And we've just got this great system of citizen-led government where anyone without a lot of experience can get engaged, can run, and can serve. And our system relies on that. I always found it so refreshing when I was a new candidate without a lot of knowledge, but just with a lot of concern for my community. I would meet people specifically of an older generation as I would knock on their doors that were so relieved that there was a young person that was stepping up to run for office. And we need to see more of that generational change in our politics. So it's never too soon for people to get engaged and involved, and there are a lot of terrific ways you can do that right here in New Hampshire. But really one thing led to another, and here I am in Congress. Yeah. And you know, this is honestly my first full-time position in public service, because everything in New Hampshire to date that I've done is part-time. It's nights and weekends, it's meetings in Concord around my business responsibilities in Manchester. And look, what keeps me going, especially at a moment where things seem so divided and for a lot of us seem so off track in this country, what keeps me going is the notion that you can still help people on any given day. And it might not be that I get my bill across the finish line or that I'm winning a lot of votes in committee or on the floor of the House, but if I can help that veteran who's being foreclosed on, or I can assist someone who is struggling to get access to health care or their veterans benefits or Social Security, like, that's a win for me. And there are a lot of ways that in Congress, it's not the headlines that define your service, but it's the relationship that you're able to build with people and the way that you can, I think, give people a sense that you're fighting for them and that there's something that you can do that's meaningful for them. So there are a lot of bills that I would list, that things I'm really proud that we were able to get across the finish line. PACT Act just a few years ago that expanded benefits for veterans exposed to burn pits and toxic substances. It's like 3.5 million veterans now that are going to get care and benefits through the VA, and several million have already filed claims. So that's a big promise that we made to folks who served, and we're paying down that debt that we owe them through legislation like that. I think of the infrastructure law that we did a few years ago in my committee, really upped the ante in terms of investments in water and drinking water and surface transportation, airports, ports, broadband, all the things that New Hampshire needs to thrive. We got that done in a bipartisan fashion. So even in a chaotic, divided Washington, there are ways that you can help people and ways that you can actually get things across the finish line. And so I know we'll get into a lot of the different topics about the sort of big and small issues of the day, but all is not lost. And I think what we need to remember is we still have power as citizens to decide what comes next and to engage to hold leaders accountable, to hold people like me accountable, to hold the President of the United States accountable. This is still a nation of, by, and for the people, and we got to make sure that that proposition is strong over the next 250 years.
Nice, thank you so much. I'm going to start us off with some questions about domestic policy. So it's become kind of a rare thing to have a male represent New Hampshire in Washington, right? So with the first in the nation in 2012, full female delegation. So, so we're seeing an erosion in women's rights, starting with the Supreme Court Dobbs decision overturning Roe, which triggered many abortion bans in the states. New Hampshire is the lone New England state that has not enacted legislation to protect the right to abortion, despite strong voter support for this right. I know you're a sponsor of several bills, the Women's Health Protection Act, the Ensuring Women's Right to Reproductive Freedom Act, which both guarantee reproductive rights. So can you tell us why you were sponsoring these bills, and what is the role of men in this fight?
Well, there is a role, for men certainly, but I'm honored to be able to serve with three really dynamic, trailblazing women in New Hampshire's congressional delegation. And Senator Shaheen has coined the term the mamas and the pappas. So I guess that's how you could, conceive of our congressional delegation. But we work closely together, and I think there's no issue that's as urgent right now as fundamental freedoms. I worry about the direction of this Supreme Court, and not just what they did in Dobbs, but what potentially is next over the horizon. If this sort of judicial activism, and you can call it that, continues. It's chipping away and eroding and unfurling the hard-fought protections that were won generations ago, including Roe, which was in place for nearly 50 years. We just celebrated an anniversary recently, and so I think about the responsibility that we have to try to move our country in a different direction. Here in New Hampshire, the live free or die state of all states, right? We don't want government interfering in our personal lives. And I think that is especially true when it comes to healthcare decisions, deeply private decisions that should be made between women, their doctors, their family members. Certainly there's no room in that exam room for members of Congress, for people who sit on the bench. And so I do think we need to work to get an alignment between how people are feeling about this issue and the sort of protections that we need. We don't have protections here in the state of New Hampshire in terms of reproductive freedom. Thankfully, when Governor Shaheen was in office back in the 1990s, she repealed the draconian 19th century laws that were on the books that would have kicked in once Dobbs was issued. But we got a lot of work to do. And I think we should work legislatively to reestablish the precedent of Roe. That's why I support a bill like that.
Yep.
And we need to make sure that people don't let go of this issue. I just think there's been a slide here over the last few years away from what people want to see out of their government. And so the less power you have as individuals, the more that it rests with politicians and judges. And I think that's really inconsistent with who we are in New Hampshire. And so we want to do everything we can to unwind that. There are a lot of other conversations aside from abortion access that are really important in sort of the conversation on reproductive health. I first ran for executive council actually back in 2012 when state officials shut off funding for Planned Parenthood and other family planning providers in New Hampshire. Had nothing to do with abortion, but had everything to do with people being able to access critical care, life-saving services at Planned Parenthood, annual exams, cancer screenings. I don't think too many people can argue with the need to make sure people get access to those types of services, but that's all sort of caught up in this argument here. And so we've got to be clear-eyed about the challenges and work to fight back and make sure that there's an opportunity to unwind some of these damaging policies.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that thoughtful answer. If anyone is turning on the news or looking to social media, there's a lot happening in Minneapolis, a lot happening with ICE, and there's a lot of confusion about how we got here. So I wanted to ask Representative Pappas, alongside 45 other Democrats, you voted for the Laken Riley Act, which immigrant rights groups say legitimizes racial profiling and expands warrantless ICE detention. In the past month, 3 American citizens were killed by ICE and DHS agents, Renee Nicole Good, Alex Jeffrey Preddy, and Keith Porter Jr. Immigrant advocacy groups, they also urge us to not forget about those who died while in ICE custody and those simply going about their lives, like Silverio Villegas Gonzalez, who was killed by ICE during a traffic stop. Reports also suggest that ICE is considering opening a detention center in Merrimack, New Hampshire, despite local opposition. I was wondering if you could explain your support for expanded ICE authority with these recent tragedies, especially when due process and community safety appear to be at odds.
Well, thanks for the question. And look, that was a bill that came up toward the end of the Biden administration. And I believe that the killing of that young student in Georgia was a tragedy. And it was an individual who was here illegally, who had been picked up for other crimes and then was released. And so the notion behind that bill was that people who are here and committing crimes, who have no business being here in the United States, that there's a public safety concern there. Actually, we've checked with the Congressional Research Service that helps Congress understand the impact of legislation. There's been one individual that has been held under the auspices of this particular act since it was passed. I think we got to focus on what we can do right now to fix a broken immigration system, but to confront what I believe are lawless actions by the administration and by ICE. There is no legal authority that says that you can shoot protesters in the streets. And so what we are seeing is something that really takes your breath away. It's hard to recognize the United States of America in what we see happening in Minneapolis. So, I've been critical of administrations of both parties for not putting in place policies that are sensible with respect to immigration. I'll continue to do that. Right now, I think we need to go after the leadership at the Department of Homeland Security. Kristi Noem should absolutely be resigned or should be removed from her position. If not, I've signed on to articles of impeachment, and I think that Congress should take that up next week. This goes beyond whether she's qualified for the job, which I don't believe she is. This is about operations that are running roughshod over civil liberties, over the law, over the Constitution. The fact that in the wake of two of these incidents where deadly force was used against American citizens, where she goes out and creates this narrative and lies to the American public about what transpired in those incidents, saying that these were both domestic terrorists. And I think a plain viewing of those videos will show that that's not what transpired there. So I really worry about this. I do think Americans support going after people who are violent, who are breaking the law, who have no business being here in the United States. There should be a core law enforcement function that can do that. What we're seeing now with ICE is not that. So I've worked to go after the additional money that they were given last summer by Congress. They were given $75 billion above their annual budget that they have wide discretion in terms of how they can use. It's one of the reasons why they're looking at a town like Merrimack and want to create one of these detention centers as part of this mass deportation apparatus. Again, we've had deportations happen under presidents before. They've been able to go after criminals without the town of Merrimack having to see a 1,500-person detention center created. So we've been working with local leaders there to try to prevent that from happening. We can't get our calls returned from the Department of Homeland Security. They won't call us back. Apparently the governor can't even get her questions answered. The town can't get their calls returned. New Hampshire believes in local control, and they're totally disrespecting the ability of communities to understand, to be good stewards, and actually to keep their community safe. I've met with the police chief recently there, who has no clue what's happening, and that will be a huge drain on local law enforcement resources in that community. So we got to be smart about how we keep this country safe. What's happening in Minnesota is not making America safer. It's also disrespecting our constitutional values. And Congress needs to step up and provide some oversight and demand some accountability. And so that's what the conversation around government funding is all about right now. There's a chance in the Senate to get some good measures in place that will put up some guardrails. By no means does it accomplish everything that's going to correct this behavior, but I think we both have to go after the leadership as well as some of the protocols that ICE is not following, which are totally inconsistent with good community policing.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So back and forth.
Yeah.
So I want to talk a little bit about bipartisanship. And you've demonstrated a lot of bipartisanship. I looked up that about 60% of your bills are such types of bills where you have people on both sides of the aisle supporting your bills. It's often difficult to work across the lines, especially in this political climate. And some view much of the messaging that comes out of the Democratic Party as like reactionary rather than proactive. It's really hard to be in the minority. Dartmouth students are curious to know if you subscribe to the abundance agenda vision for the Democratic Party's agenda, and if not, what alternative positive vision do you have for how the Democrats can lead on economic and social policy, and how would you work to enact that in the Senate?
Yeah, well, thanks for that. It's a big question.
It is a big question.
And look,
we're getting it.
Yeah, I mean, that question of bipartisanship comes up a lot. Like, is that the way that we're going to fix things and solve problems? And I think you never back down from sort of your core values. You never want to, let those go. But you should always figure out, because politics is the art of the possible, how you can potentially work with people to move the ball forward and actually advance some things that are going to help people. We're trying to do that on healthcare right now, and we're running into a lot of roadblocks, but if nothing's done, 40,000 families in New Hampshire are going to lose insurance and be priced out of the marketplace. And so I worry about that. That's really going to hurt the delivery of rural healthcare in parts like this in our state. So we're trying to find ways to work together. I've been partnering with Republicans on that. I'd like to see something done that can help people, and at the end of the day, if we can't, then we take that to the ballot box and take that to the people and hold the leaders accountable that weren't able to deliver. With respect to where Democrats are right now, I mean, I think this is such a challenging moment because most of us feel like this is a five-alarm fire for our democracy. We've got no president, no one leader, no one who speaks for all Democrats or folks that are disaffected with this administration across the country. That's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity because it means that community by community, state by state, we can decide what message works, what connects. this can be a time where we reimagine and reinvigorate our democracy and the Democratic Party. And I think we got to recognize a few things. Number one, this country and this economy is unfair and unequal, and it's been that way for decades. Republicans might like to say this was a problem that Joe Biden created with respect to inflation, but the inequities that working families face and the pressure on the middle class has been building really since I was born in the early 1980s. We have seen CEO pay increase 800%, and real wages for average workers have barely budged over that period of time. So people are doing everything right, and they're working hard. They're working harder than ever, but costs continue to skyrocket. Yeah. We have to be the party that recognizes the inequities, the unfairness of the economy, and speaks out for working people, and truly puts some good ideas on the table around housing and childcare and healthcare and education that's going to help people build a life and be able to get ahead. There's just no margin for error for too many families right now. They're falling behind. So I do think abundance is a tool to be able to figure out, okay, how do we design policies in a way that's actually going to get benefit out there? One of the frustrations I had during the Biden years is that there were a lot of well-intentioned bills, but the benefits took so long to get out there to people. I'll give you an example, prescription drug pricing, something that we talked about for years, taking on the power of the pharmaceutical industry to deliver lower prices for people, but it took 5 years to negotiate those first 10 drugs, but you can only get those prices if you're a Medicare beneficiary. And so that was so limited and so small, it didn't speak to the really systemic change that we need. And a lot of this has to deal with corporate special interest power that I think is really running amok in Washington. They had their fingerprints all over the tax legislation that was passed last year. And it's hurting our ability to be able to get things on the table that are going to help workers and working families. So I think the Democratic Party has a huge opportunity here to reconnect with people around economic issues. Trump is doing anything but focus on lowering costs. I mean, the tariffs are a 19th century debunked economic strategy that's actually raising prices for folks all across the board. So that's a huge conversation starter, I think, with people. But we got to come armed with the kinds of policies that will help, and just a willingness to listen and understand where people are. We don't always have to be talking at people. Right. In fact, we should start by listening and making sure that we're understanding where people are. That's how we become an authentic, trusted voice.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that vision. We're going to look a little bit toward foreign policy and international politics. As I'm sure you heard, Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, recently warned at the World Economic Forum that, quote, "We are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition," end quote, in the global order, suggesting that major powers are increasingly weaponizing economic tools like tariffs and supply chains. In light of this and related tensions, including the U.S. seizure of Venezuelan tankers, of the capture of President Nicolas Maduro, and discussions around Greenland's strategic importance, how do you see the role of the United States evolving on the global stage? And given your bid for the U.S. Senate, what should U.S. leadership look like going forward?
Well, I worry about where we are and the sort of foreign policy that we've seen that I don't think is centered around keeping our country safe. And this era of great power competition that we find ourselves in, really putting ourselves in the strongest position possible to outcompete China and to make sure that our economy will continue to lead the world and innovate and provide the benefits that the American people deserve. So I just think there has been occasion after occasion over the last year where Donald Trump seems guided by whatever he feels like on any given day, as opposed to what is going to help our allies, what's going to be good for our national security interests. Greenland's a perfect example of that. We are driving a wedge, literally, between the NATO alliance and alienating the United States from our closest allies and friends around the world. That's destabilizing and I believe dangerous for the United States and our long-term interests. And it has come about, it seems, because he also, in addition to this 19th century economic strategy, has this notion that the United States should rebuild an empire, that we should be able to intervene anywhere in the Western Hemisphere that we feel like. I think that breeds distrust around the world. We've alienated Canada now with trade policy, so now they're cutting deals with China on electric vehicles and other things that are going to put the United States and our companies and our workers at a disadvantage. So this isn't smart. And I think that on foreign policy, we need a foreign policy that's guided by our core values that have long guided our foreign policy: democracy, support for NATO and our alliances, making sure that we are a nation that stands firm on its values for human rights, but ultimately that we're looking out for our national security interests. And that's what I worry is getting lost in all this here. So I think there is a role for Congress to play. I mean, we saw a number of Republicans and Democrats go to Denmark recently to help communicate the message, hey, there's still bipartisan support in the Congress for our relationship with Denmark, for NATO. And that's all well and good, but we have to reestablish that in a much more significant way. Congress needs to step up to the plate. I mean, we are the Article I branch of our government, after all, and too often, Congress has just rolled over and become a subsidiary of the executive branch. That's not how our founders intended this system to work. So I don't care who's in the White House. We have to be looking out for those core interests and not putting the United States at a long-term disadvantage. I fear some of that is happening without much reaction from Congress, and we got to give members of the House and Senate the sort of courage they need to continue to go forward. So we're looking for those partners anywhere we can find them, but they've been few and far between.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, you touched on a little bit of what I was going to ask you, but I'm hoping you can build
Okay.
a little bit more, speaking about the tremendous expansion of presidential powers under the current president, and how Congress has really just sort of acquiesced and failed to act as an equal branch of government. And so if you could speak a little bit more about how you see the role of Congress, the Senate in particular, and what steps that you would take if you were elected senator. So just expand a little bit more. Yeah.
Well, war powers is one area
Right.
where we have historically seen administration after administration continue to move the goalposts with respect to the use of military force. And so I think this is a prime example of, they've gone into Venezuela. They provided communication with oil companies and corporations, but not with members of Congress about that operation in advance. And there was no sense that they even needed to come to Congress to ask for permission. So I've voted for a war powers resolution that says any additional action in Venezuela, you need to come to Congress and not just inform Congress, but get authorization. I think that should be the case when we're talking about large-scale military operations in our hemisphere or anywhere around the world, whether we're talking about what happened in Iran or maybe what the administration is thinking about for Cuba and other parts of the world. And so, there have been those opportunities to support resolutions like that. I will continue to do that because I believe that people, through their elected representatives, should be making decisions about the use of military force in war and peace. And I think the tariffs is another prime example of the way that we've seen a shift to the executive branch of an authority that's spelled out in the Constitution that rests with the Congress of the United States. And so the Supreme Court is taking up that case. They will likely rule pretty soon. I'm not naive to think that they're just automatically going to look at the plain language of the Constitution and rule against the administration. But I think it would be significant if they did to help us tip the balance back to, I think, where it belongs. Now, we've been introducing legislation to try to chip away at the president's use of tariffs, which I think have been very reckless for our small business community and for consumers. It's driven a wedge between us and Canada with respect to trade. We're not seeing those Canadian visitors come to New Hampshire in the same numbers that they did in the past, and that's hurt a lot of our seasonal businesses here. So we've put some bills out there to exempt small businesses from paying tariffs. These are small companies, often that are, they're retailers, they're manufacturing things here in the U.S. So we're talking about U.S. jobs that are being adversely impacted by tariffs that is being communicated that other nations are paying, but we know that our businesses and consumers are paying them right here. Let's exempt those small businesses that don't have the advocacy to get into the Oval Office and get an exemption. Or let's find ways to exempt groceries. Half of our produce comes from outside of this country, and sure, we should be supporting our farmers and growing more things here in the United States and using sustainable agricultural practices. But until we can do that, let's not hurt consumers that are struggling to afford grocery bills right now. So I think we've got to think about this both from a common sense perspective around cost, but also where that constitutional authority lies, and I think it lies with the Congress.
Thank you. Keeping that foreign policy thread and reflecting on real American attitudes about the U.S. government's actions abroad, there was a November 2023 Gallup poll where 32% of Americans approved of Israel's military actions in Gaza, while 60% disapproved. That disapproval has only grown as respected international bodies, including a United Nations Commission of Inquiry, Amnesty International, and Israeli human rights organizations such as B'Tselem have all issued legal analyses concluding that Israel military actions conducted in Gaza meet key elements of genocide under international law. At the same time, the United States continues to send billions of dollars in military aid to Israel. This is included through supplemental appropriations that you have voted for, often with bipartisan support and amid heavy lobbying by groups such as AIPAC, from whom you've accepted campaign contributions. Given these legal findings and the clear shift in public opinion, what is the goal you hope to achieve by continuing to fund the Israeli military?
Well, my goal is to make sure that the United States works with our allies so that, number one, Israel, which is the only democracy in the Middle East, is secure. Number two, that the Palestinian people have an opportunity and are on a path to self-determination, and that they can have a state for themselves that exists peacefully alongside Israel. And number three, and really this should be number one, that the United States is looking out for strategically what's best to keep our own people safe. That's all a big conversation. And right now we have an incredibly fragile ceasefire that's in place. And I've been over months and months pushing for a ceasefire, pushing against the limitations that we have seen on aid that needs to be able to get to people in harm's way. I voted against security assistance that lacked that $9 billion that my colleagues and I were fighting for to get the help into people in Gaza that needed food and medical supplies and all the rest. I think this Netanyahu government, frankly, has not been a reliable partner both for President Trump and President Biden. And I hope soon that we will see a new election in Israel and a change. He's got right-wing partners in his government that I think undermine the long-term prospect for peace in the region. That's why I've signed on to legislation that seeks to put in place sanctions on settlers who are committing violence in the West Bank, and why I have signed on to legislation that calls for Israel to maximize humanitarian assistance. So that's where my focus has been. Look, October 7th was the deadliest day for the Jewish people since the Holocaust. And at the same time, we saw civilians losing their lives in a horrible war in Gaza. And I think you have to value innocent life the same, no matter who that person is, but also understand that we've got terrorist organizations in the region that are funded by Iran largely, that seek to continue to target our troops, that wish death to America and death to Israel. And we have to be clear-eyed about that threat. So I am hopeful that this ceasefire will continue to build momentum. We need to get to these next stages where the Israeli military will fully pull back, where Hamas will lay down their arms, and then the global community can work on how to set up civilian society and how to make sure that there is opportunity for people in Gaza and the West Bank. I've visited the West Bank before. I've met young people there who have no real job prospects or hope for opportunity. And if you're not focused on how people can have a chance, then I think you're moving in a direction that just is going to perpetuate the sort of conflict that we've seen continue to persist through generations. So I hope we can see this peace continue to take hold. I want the Palestinian people to have self-determination. I want Israel to be safe. I want everyone to be safe. And ultimately, I want the United States to be safe.
Thank you so much for answering our prepared remarks. We'd like to now turn to the audience for questions, and so what we'd like to have you do is come up to the microphones if you have a question, and we'd love to have students ask questions as well.
On. Thanks, Chris. Just a quick question. Is there any way to take back that $75 billion? Do we have to win both houses?
Well, we would need another legislative effort to do it, which is why I introduced the bill that I did to go after that extra $75 billion and actually redirect it. If we're talking about keeping our country safe, let's support our local police departments that are accredited, that are struggling right now based on high property taxes to be able to afford the equipment and resources they need to do their job. So I think that's a smarter use of those dollars. So we've introduced a bill on that. There are some competing bills out there, but I really think it's going to take a shift in control of Congress to effectuate that. What I worry about is as we debate policies and procedures and trying to hold the leadership at Homeland Security accountable, they're sitting on this huge slush fund that's essentially 4 times their annual budget. So they are pre-funded and well-resourced, and there's no other department of government or agency that has that kind of a deal. So it's really unprecedented, and I think it was a shame that they got that blank check in the first place. And we got to work to, I think, provide some accountability where there hasn't been any. We also need the American people to continue to be weighing in on this. Ultimately, leaders in Congress need to hear from their constituents. I will say, when that $75 billion passed as part of the so-called Big Beautiful Bill last summer, I'd never received more communications in our office at that time from, and not just sort of organized efforts that groups will get people to call in, like really organic, one-off communications from folks that cared deeply about what they were seeing. And I think we need the same sort of effort, right now, because people are reacting against this, and it's really Congress's ability to. We have an ability to pull back those funds.
Hello.
Hi.
So my question is a little bit about online privacy.
Can you just introduce yourself
Oh,
real
yes,
quick?
yeah. I'm Tyler Sanders. I'm a New Hampshire resident and a freshman at Dartmouth.
Yep.
I don't actually remember if I'm in your district. So
What town are you in?
New Boston.
New Boston? Yeah, not my district. But it's a great town.
So my question has a little bit to do with the state of online privacy. And so recently there's been developments in a lot of Anglosphere nations, such as the US, and most notably Great Britain, where steps have been put in place that have forced users on the internet to submit pictures of government IDs in order to gain access to certain services. This is prevalent on platforms such as YouTube, Character.ai, and a bunch of others. How do you think it is the government's responsibility to ensure the safety of children such that they may not access material they are maybe not suited to, while also respecting a citizen's right, and especially an adult's right, to access content without giving their personal data in the hands of the government or into the hands of large companies such as Palantir, which represent a threat to online privacy?
Yeah. Thank you for the question. There's actually a legislative effort underway right now in some of the relevant committees that I don't sit on in Congress that have purview and jurisdiction over privacy issues and technology issues. I worry that it's going to come out and be another sort of giveaway to big tech at a time where we need to be holding these companies to account. There is a lot in the online space that, frankly, we haven't contended with in a legislative arena for a long time, really since the late 1990s, when we had a Telecommunications Act passed that now still governs, the myriad of, technological services and apps and companies that are out there in that space that couldn't have been conceived of back at the time when that legislation was written. And so I do think there is a responsibility that big tech needs to have to keep their platforms safe, to make sure that our data is protected. And ultimately, I just think we've seen other countries moving in that direction, but the United States has been really silent and absent from that sort of a push. I do worry about this in terms of politics because it's become more of a partisan affair around big tech, where you had sort of the cadre of billionaire big tech titans right there in the front row at the inauguration this past year. And so no doubt they have a huge megaphone that they can use to influence policymakers and influence the administration. It was just a few months ago where they were looking to get a carve-out in legislation to prevent any sort of regulation being brought forward at the state level on AI, for instance. And I'm glad that was stopped. We sort of called attention to that. But we need to be thinking about how we address privacy. So I'm not, in the middle of those conversations and negotiations around that particular piece of bill. The Online Child Safety Act, I think, is it. But I appreciate your thoughts on it. And I think New Hampshire is a state that has long wanted privacy protections in place. And there's actually long been bipartisan support here and some collaboration at the State House on those measures. And so I would kind of view any sort of legislation that would come forward through the lens of kind of what's best for New Hampshire and understanding that we should be protecting protecting consumers against not just the government, but against for-profit corporations. Yeah, hi.
My name is Ian. I'm a first year at Dartmouth.
Great.
So my question revolves around higher education. As you
Yeah.
may or may not know, Dartmouth has adopted a policy of institutional restraint, and a lot of higher education institutions, like the Ivy League and like other colleges, have gone at battle with the Trump administration. Where do you think the role of dissent is on like college students on in campuses or higher education, and where do you think schools should draw the line with the Trump administration and with just politics in general? As to what they comment or where they draw the line on funding cuts and other things?
Well, I've been grateful for institutions that have spoken out pretty clearly when funding is being jeopardized. And I think about my alma mater, Harvard, that was really at the forefront around threats over the loss of research dollars that are really critical, not just to that particular university, but really to the whole ecosystem around it, and to a lot of job prospects too for students. I think that if you take a step back, Donald Trump and this administration are incredibly transactional, and they're looking to exert power not just over the federal bureaucracy, but really over civil society too. And so whether it's the media, whether it's higher education, you name the institution. Big law is another example. They've tried to bend, sort of the will of these institutions to, what the president is looking for on any given day. And I just think that's not how things should work. So I would hope that there are ways that people can continue to speak out when, funding is threatened. Ultimately, we are a free and fair society. We are not a top-down authoritarian country. We thrive as a free and open society because we have universities, because we have a marketplace of ideas out there. And that's something that we should always cherish and work to support. I do want to give credit. I think the university here has done a good job creating dialogue on campus and bringing people together, and those sorts of conversations have been really powerful. And you can do that while you also, find ways to show some courage and speak out against policies and funding cuts that are not just detrimental to your institution, but really to the whole ballgame. I think about a number of my colleagues that I've had conversations with, including Republicans from rural districts. And oftentimes their universities are the biggest employers in their area. And so that funding is really important. And if Harvard can't stand up and push back, how is some small college or university system in rural America without a big endowment going to be able to do it? So I just think it's a time for us to all remember that we created a presidency with limited authority, with checks and balances. And we all have a role in making sure that that balance continues to hold. I certainly do in Congress, and I want to continue to find ways to get my colleagues to sort of weigh in and speak out, not just behind the scenes, but publicly on some of this stuff. Yeah, thanks for your question. Hi.
Hi, my name is Zosia, and I'm a class of 2027 student from Poland. Representative Pappas, the internet has played an increasingly important role in modern-day politics, both in the US and on the global stage. In particular, the alt-right, manosphere, and grifter movements have gained significant traction in the past few years, leading more and more young people down the radical conservative pipeline. How do you see the internet and mainstream culture in relation to the goals of the Democratic Party, especially in encouraging young people to engage with local, state, and national politics?
Well, thanks. The way we consume information continues to rapidly change. I just think about a few campaign cycles ago and sort of how we would communicate with voters, sort of what we do through our official office, and it looks so much different today than it used to. And just to kind of build on what I was saying before, there's a responsibility for these technology companies to put in place sensible guardrails. Congress needs to insist on it, but there's work that they can be doing to keep users safe, to protect privacy, but also to prevent hate from being weaponized and from just whipping through social media and these systems in a way that can be incredibly dangerous. So I worry about how some aspects of social media have really become a cesspool. And I worry about the rage that exists on those platforms, the bots that are being operated by foreign adversaries that are being used to divide Americans on a day-to-day basis. So we got to find some ways to establish some legal guardrails. I agree with that. We all have to be critical consumers of the information that's out there, and I know you all are and are helping to identify those threats and challenges. But I think that we also, as elected officials, policymakers, as citizens, we have to find sensible ways to engage and use those tools in a positive fashion. I have to go before audiences of people that don't agree with me. I have to go on podcasts and shows, that have a conservative bent so that they get to hear from a different perspective. We need to be reaching people and engaging people any way we possibly can. I think that we can't have people shut off from society and become so just hardened in their views that they're not willing to consider an alternative or to try to see a different side of the story. I think it's, in some ways what we have in Congress is a reflection of what's happening across the country. We have leaders that a lot of them don't talk to each other. They don't want to, necessarily work across the aisle and consider that maybe their idea isn't the best, but that they could learn from another person in a conversation like this. So we need to figure out how to get into the real world more, spaces like this, get in front of each other. I think people are yearning for community and belonging and a connection to something. And some people are finding that in some hateful spaces on the internet. And so the rest of us need to figure out how we respond and create other opportunities for people to find that sort of connection. I try to do that in the small way that I can as an elected official, just getting out there and seeing people and trying to identify ways that we have some common ground. At the end of the day, this is a great country. We have tremendous capacity. We continue to lead the world in so many areas, including technology, but it's not destined to always be that way. And we all have a responsibility to create the right sort of conditions to keep people safe and to keep the dialogue in a place where we can all move together as a society. And so that's tough. I think the authoritarian regimes of the world are looking at the United States right now and thinking that the moment for democracy might have passed. And I'm deeply worried about that. And so we have to have an answer for it. And I do believe that the future is democratic, that the future involves the power being in the hands of the citizens. And we have to show that a democracy truly can work, that we can translate the will of the people into something that's meaningful for them. What I don't want is for people to give up and to just back away and to back off into certain corners of the internet. And so we got to give people the sense that they matter, they belong to something, they're a part of this society, they can help determine and shape the future. And certainly I hope young people are feeling that. I do think as we approach election season, especially here in New Hampshire, there are great ways for young people to have their voice heard, whatever that happens to be. Thanks. Hi.
Hey, Congressman. My name's Brennan Hoffman.
Yeah.
I'm a first year here at Dartmouth, and I think it's kind of funny that your two main Republican opponents are former senators in their 60s who already lost and are trying to give it another go. In fact, Scott Brown was here last term, and he went to this Turning Point USA event, didn't say a word, just went up, took a photo, and just left. You're a lot more chatty than him. And I was just kind of wondering what your thoughts on your opponents are, Johnson Unu and Scott Brown.
Yeah. Well, I'm here in my official capacity, so I don't want to make it a campaign event. New Hampshire's a very intimate state politically, and so you all get to know all the other players out there, and you all get to sort of see them and get in front of them from time to time. But so I run into Scott Brown at events. I've run into Johnson Unu at events, and they both have been in the Senate. One from a different state, I will say. Not from this one, but it certainly will be I think a pretty robust campaign season going forward. So I'll leave it at that. But I think it is a hard time to be in public service and be in the political arena. There are a lot of feelings across the board about sort of where we are as a country, and I just hope we can come through this. I do think, just to hit on one point you made about these folks having been in office, I do think this is a time where people want to see something different. They want to turn the page and perhaps usher in a new generation of leadership. And that's not a political comment about my campaign or anything. I think it's a comment on kind of the leadership in Washington. I will say this, people stay far too long in Washington, D.C., and I think we need some more turnover and would benefit from it at all levels. I think you might be onto something. Yeah, thanks.
So I've been given the note that there's time for just one more question, and I promised Quinn that Quinn could get the last student question, so I apologize.
I'll stick around, though, if you want to chat after.
Yeah,
thanks.
so go ahead, Quinn, and have your last question, and then I just have some closing remarks.
Absolutely. Well, I was going to start by saying thank you for answering our questions. Thank you for answering our community's questions. We take a lot of pride here about asking the hard ones and having the opportunity for the complex answer. This one's a little bit different. This one is for every student like myself who wants to meet the political moment, who wants to make a difference through public service. What advice do you have for us, and what can we start doing today?
Yeah, show up, engage, have your voice heard. I learned early on in New Hampshire that you don't wait for your chance. You step up and you do the work now. And I remember when I first got elected to the State House, there was a more senior member who was giving me kind of a tour and an orientation and said, you know, after you're here for a couple years, you can start to introduce bills and you can start to speak on the floor on legislation. And you gotta like watch and see how this place works before you start becoming part of the process. And I thought, that's not why I did this. Like I worked hard and earned the confidence of my community so I could start that work now. So don't let anyone tell you you have to wait. I think that your time is now. I don't care what you believe. Like we're gonna benefit from having an active citizenry who's paying attention, who cares, who's motivated to try to help people make this country better and get some things done. So, whether that is, you name the issue, whether you care about climate, whether you care about healthcare, whether you care about economic issues, which by the way, as we talk about the economy, I mean, we're a state that does well in a number of different measures, but if you're a young person right now, you are dealing with a challenging economic environment, high tuition costs and student debt. Housing costs that are just, it makes it impossible to see how you could potentially own a home or find the apartment that you need. And job market, by the way, that's changing very rapidly, especially for young job seekers. So I think that issue in particular is one that young people need to be part of the conversation on. Too often we think of that as an issue that maybe your parents or grandparents are thinking about, but it's really your generation that can help us, I think, shape economic policies that are going to focus on making life better and ensuring that everyone has opportunity. So yeah, I would say don't wait around. You have power now. You're going to be dealing with the consequences of the decisions that are being made in Concord and Washington far longer than me or anyone else. And so we want you at the table. And if there are ways that I can engage with students here, regardless of their beliefs, like let's see how you can be part of the conversation. Come visit us in Washington. We'd love to show you around down there. But also, I want to hear from you. I think the most important thing that I can remember is that my job is representative, and that is a job description and a job title all in once. And I can't represent if I'm not hearing from people and if we're not creating that feedback loop between what people are feeling, how they're consuming the world around them, what they need, and then how we can turn that into actual progress in Washington. So you're part of that conversation. We don't want you to be left out.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, so I want to thank you so much, Congressman Pappas, for coming. What a great conversation. What a treat to have you in this in community and conversation. So I really appreciate that you took the time. So I'd like the audience to join me in thanking Congressman Pappas.
Thanks,
I'd also like to thank our co-sponsors for this event in the Law and Democracy, the United States at 250 Speaker Series, so the Nelson A. Rockefeller Center, Dartmouth Dialogues, the Office of Dean and Faculty of Arts and Sciences, the Office of the Associate Dean for Social Sciences, our program planning staff, Devora, Madison, Meg, who work tirelessly, and they are really the engine that makes this all possible. Our next event in this series is Retribution, Donald Trump and the Campaign That Changed America, with Jonathan Karl and Peter Charlembus, who's a Dartmouth grad 2020, on Monday, February 2nd at 5:30 p.m. here in Filene. I also want to thank all of you for coming out today. It's such a pleasure to see so many people from the community here. We ask that you remain in your seats until Congressman Pappas has left the room. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Oh, thanks, everyone. Thanks very much.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
been a real pleasure.
Yeah,
I hope we get to
yeah,
see you.
nice to see you. Yeah, thanks very much for all the questions. I appreciate it. Oh, sure, yeah.
Need to wait till he leaves. That was the instruction that I was given.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
We will take your microphones, though.